Christian Heroes Then and Now. Eric Liddell. Something Greater Than Gold by Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 9. There was just one problem. It seems we Liddells are always saying goodbye to each other, Eric commented grimly to his brother Robert. Robert nodded. It certainly does. Still, Dad has worked very hard, and I've been a bit worried about his health lately. It's probably a good thing they're taking a 2-year furlough. Eric smiled. He tried to think of it as a good thing, but it was more difficult for him than Robert. Robert had a family of his own now, a wife and a baby girl. Eric, on the other hand, still lived with his parents and loved their company and that of his younger sister and brother. He would miss having them around to talk to. All the time he'd been at school in England, he hadn't felt like he knew his family well. He had made a start getting to know them better when they were together in Edinburgh. But since being in China, he felt he'd gotten to know his family on a whole different level. As a result, it was much harder this time to say goodbye to them. Eric and Robert stood on the dock and watched as their parents, along with Jenny and Ernest, climbed the gangway and boarded the German liner Saarbrücken. They waved furiously as the ship pulled away from the dock. As the Saarbrücken steamed towards the horizon, Eric held on to the one thought that made him happy at that moment. In another year, he too would be going back to Scotland on furlough. There he would stay with his parents in Edinburgh. With most of his family back in Scotland, Eric had to move out of number 6 London Mission Street, where the family had lived for the past 4 years. He moved into a 4-bedroom apartment in which 3 other teachers from the Anglo-Chinese college already lived. The apartment had a large living area, and the 4 roommates had a Chinese servant, Kui Lin, who did their shopping, cleaning, and cooking. One of Eric's new roommates was always doing interesting things, and Eric learned a lot from him. Another roommate had a large stamp collection, and Eric soon started a collection of his own. Eric's 3rd roommate played billiards and taught Eric how to play. He probably regretted it because Eric was a fast learner. Soon Eric could beat him and just about everyone else in Tyneton who played billiards. When Eric was not busy with stamp collecting, billiards, or his sports and teaching responsibilities at school, he served as Sunday school superintendent for the Union Church. Despite being so busy, Eric felt lonely without his parents around. He was 27, and for the first time in his life, he began to think seriously about getting married and having children of his own. He had no idea whom he would marry, but slowly he began to notice one particular young woman, Florence Mackenzie, or Flo, as everyone called her. Flo had been staying at Pai Tai Ho with her parents when Eric first arrived in China. She was petite, with sparkly brown eyes and long curly black hair. She played the organ at church, was a strong Christian, and loved to laugh and play practical jokes. Eric loved being around her. There was just one problem. Florence Mackenzie was only 17 years old and in her last year of high school. Eric had to come up with some way to get to know her better without making it look like he was dating someone 10 years his junior. After giving it much thought, he decided to befriend the entire graduating class at Tyneton Grammar School. He would invite all the students to the popular Kiesling's Cafe for afternoon tea, or take them on a walk or a picnic. On these outings, he would spend time with Flo. Of course, he tried to make it look as though he was just being friendly with her, as he was with the other students. But the more time he spent around her, the more he liked her. Finally, Eric decided that she was the one he wanted to marry. Trouble was, he was too shy to ask her. He worried that she might say no, or worse, that she'd say yes while her parents said no. He wasn't sure what to do, so he just kept taking the entire graduating class out for cups of tea at Kiesling's Cafe. Eventually, summer vacation rolled around, and Eric, along with his roommates, went to stay at Pai Tai Ho. Understandably, Eric was thrilled to learn that the Mackenzie family, including Flo, would also be staying there for the summer, and in a cabin only two doors down from his. Eric became the chief organizer of outings for the summer. He arranged a 4-day walking tour up nearby Mount Pininting, tennis tournaments, picnics by the sea, play readings, anything that brought him and Flo together. His 3 roommates soon began to notice that whatever event Eric planned, he always made sure Flo knew about it. On these outings, Eric learned a lot more about Flo. Flo told him she was going back to Toronto, where her family was from, in the fall to train as a nurse. The training would take 4 years. After training, when she was 21, Flo planned to return to China to work in a hospital. Eric's heart raced as he thought about it. He knew he couldn't marry a 17-year-old, but what about a 21-year-old? That would be a perfect age for a woman to get married. Eric waited until he returned to Tyson to ask Flo to marry him. At first, she thought he was joking. After all, Eric was a famous Olympic champion, and she was just a young woman fresh out of high school. "Are you sure you really mean this?" she asked him. "Yes, I do," he replied simply. Flo didn't have to think hard about her answer. Eric's proposal was a dream come true, and Flo eagerly accepted. Flo's parents cheerfully gave their permission for the couple to eventually marry. Soon, Eric was writing home to his mother asking her to buy an engagement ring with 5 diamonds and send it to him in China. The ring arrived just before Flo and her family were to return to Toronto. Eric presented the ring to Flo, and so began their 4-year engagement. The couple planned to marry when Flo finished nursing school. After Flo left China, Eric began to prepare for a year-long furlough in Scotland. As always, he had lots of plans. He decided he would use the year to study to become an ordained minister in the Scottish Congregational Church. Along with teaching, this would allow him to do more traditional missionary work, such as running a church and baptizing new converts. He also planned to make time in his travels to visit Flo, both on his way home from China and on his trip back to China. What he didn't plan for, though, was the fact that he wasn't the only person making plans for his stay in Scotland. It had been 7 years since Eric had won his gold medal, and since there had been another Olympic Games in that time, Eric assumed that everyone in Scotland had forgotten him. He assumed wrong. After a wonderful visit with Flo in Canada, which ended all too soon, Eric was back on a ship headed across the Atlantic Ocean for the British Isles. When he finally arrived in Edinburgh, his welcome was a huge surprise. Instead of being forgotten, Eric Liddell was more popular than ever. A large welcome home gathering, organized by a number of well-known Scottish ministers and sports stars, was held for him. Eric was stunned. All over the country, people wanted him to speak at or attend dinners in his honor. These engagements quickly mounted up until Eric could hardly keep track of all the invitations he received. He hated to think that he might forget one by mistake because he didn't want to disappoint anyone. After a few weeks, the college at which he was studying to become an ordained minister set up an Eric Liddell committee to handle Eric's appointments. This was a great relief to Eric as it gave him more time during the week to study. On the weekends, he spoke wherever the committee had arranged for him to be. He still got nervous when he spoke in public at these events, but he realized he had a wonderful opportunity to tell people about missionary work and the needs of China. These events weren't confined to Scotland. Eric traveled to England and Ireland to speak. Everywhere he went, the Flying Scotsman received a hero's welcome, and many people who otherwise never went to church listened eagerly to his talks. Eric was delighted to be back in Edinburgh, living with his family. He spent time with many of his friends too. D.P. Thompson, who had arranged Eric's first talk in Armadale 6 years before, traveled to many of the meetings with Eric. Eric also visited Elsa McKechnie and her family. Elsa was still the head of his official fan club. She and Eric had written regularly to each other during the years he'd been in China, and she was delighted to see him again in person. Although Eric had 2 or 3 meetings to speak at every weekend during his furlough, he felt most comfortable when talking to people like Elsa one-on-one. When he looked out at a huge audience, he would try to think of them as individuals and not just one large group. Eric always had a real concern for each person he met, and it was this attitude that made him different from many other famous people. On one occasion, Eric was visiting a large church. While there, the pastor asked him to sign the visitor's book. Eric was happy to do so, and when he had finished signing his name, he wrote a Chinese character beside it. "What does that mean?" asked the pastor. "It's Chinese for keep smiling," replied Eric. The pastor smiled. "How nice. I will be sure to show it to one of the women in my church. She always signs her letters and notes with those words. In English, of course." Eric nodded. "Sometimes it doesn't seem she has a lot to smile about," continued the pastor. "She was in a bad accident 5 years ago, and she has been in and out of the hospital ever since." "What's the matter with her?" asked Eric. "Just about everything. Her scalp was torn off, and she lost one eye in the accident. The doctors were able to do skin grafts on her, but it has all been so very painful. She's nearly blind and deaf and gets terrible headaches. But she will love to see Keep Smiling in the visitor's book. That's her message to us all." "Would she have time for a visit from me?" inquired Eric. The pastor looked surprised. "You would visit her? I can't think of anything she would love more than a visit from you." And so it was that Eric visited Bella Montgomery in her small brick terrace home. The two of them spent an hour together, happily chatting away. Eric marveled at her wonderful attitude. After he'd left, Bella Montgomery wrote a letter thanking him for his visit. The letter arrived in the mail just as Eric was about to catch a train for London for a speaking engagement. Eric stuffed the letter into his jacket pocket so that he could read it on the train when he had more time. Once on the train, Eric found himself alone in a compartment. When he had stowed his bags in the overhead rack, he sat down to read Bella Montgomery's letter. He smiled as he read. The grammar and spelling were not perfect, but the letter told of how Bella had found Jesus Christ to be her best friend through all her problems. When he had finished reading, Eric folded the letter neatly and tucked it back in his jacket pocket. At the next station, a young man boarded the train and seated himself in the same compartment with Eric. From the look on the man's face, Eric could see that he was very unhappy. As the train chugged through the countryside, the young man's story came out. He had lost his job, his girlfriend had left him, and his family had branded him a complete failure. He told Eric he could see no reason to go on living and wondered whether suicide might be the answer to how he was feeling. At first, Eric couldn't think of the right words to say to the young man, but then he realized he didn't have to. He slid his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out Bella Montgomery's letter. "Here, read this," he said as he handed it to the man. "It's no use," the young man replied, placing his head in his hands. "Please, read it. It's only a page." Eric's voice soothed the man, who reached out and took the letter. When the man had finished reading, Eric told him a little about Bella Montgomery and how she was able to see difficult circumstances as opportunities. By the time the train arrived in London, the young man was much happier than he had been. Bella Montgomery's letter had inspired him. He was no longer talking about suicide, but was considering the possibilities he would find in London. While home on furlough, Eric had decided not to do any running, since there wasn't enough time to fit it in. Eric made one exception, though. While in London, he visited his old school, Eltham College. All the boys who attended the school knew about its most famous old boy. The walls in the administration building were all lined with many athletic plaques and trophies that Eric and his brother had won for the school. Eric had been invited to Eltham College to present the prizes at the annual sports day. He was glad for the opportunity to do so, but it was not enough for the boys, who wanted to see Eric Liddell run on his home track. Finally, after a lot of good-natured nagging, Eric agreed to race in the 220 yards against the best runners in the school. He strolled up to the starting line in his regular shoes, his jacket draped casually over his arm, and not looking at all like a serious runner. When the starter's pistol fired, though, it was another story. Eric shot off his mark and streaked around the track, finishing a long way in front of the best runner in the school. The students whistled and clapped for the champion who had once been just like them. Wherever he went around the British Isles, people asked Eric what he thought about the political situation in China. Was there going to be a war? Who did he think would win it? These were difficult questions. Scotland was a long way from Tyson, and circumstances were changing so rapidly in China that sometimes Eric didn't know what to make of it all. The Nationalist Army under General Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist forces were engaged in many vicious clashes with each other across the country, especially in north-central China. Villages were burned, homes were looted, and crops were destroyed wherever there was fighting. In 1931, Japan, realizing that China was in a weakened state, invaded Manchuria in the north. At first, Eric's friends from the Anglo-Chinese College had written and told him that there was not much fighting around Tyson and that life was going on as normal. Then, about 2/3 of the way through his furlough, Eric began to get letters from China that confirmed what he'd read in the newspapers. The Japanese had become bolder. They had bombed Shanghai, the busiest port in China. Japanese gunboats and aircraft had flattened large tracts of the city with their relentless bombing. Eventually, Britain had been able to get Japan to stop the attack, but the future for China did not look stable. The country was in a three-way tug of war between the communists, the nationalists, and the Japanese, and Eric had no idea who would finally win. All the questions, though, made him want to get back to China more than ever. There was a lot of missionary work still to be done there. Towards the end of his furlough, there was a lot of excitement in the little home. Jenny was getting married to Dr. Charles Somerville, and Eric was able to attend the ceremony, as were Robert and his family, who had just arrived home on furlough. The whole family was together again, which made the wedding a wonderful occasion. Another wonderful family event took place in June 1932 when Eric passed his exams and was ordained as a minister in the Scottish Congregational Church. He was now the Reverend Eric Liddell. With his ordination, however, it was time for him to return to China. Of course, he hated leaving his parents again, especially since his father had been given some difficult news. Eric's parents would not be returning to China as they had planned. The London Missionary Society had decided that James Liddell was not in very good health, and it was time for him to retire from missionary work. As Eric made preparations for his return, he comforted himself with the thought that, in some way at least, he would be able to take his father's place in China. Eric was both sorry and excited as he set out for China again. Saying goodbye to his family was hard, but on the other hand, he had a visit in Toronto to look forward to.